Welcome to episode 73 of Dating Skills Podcast. This is Angel Donovan. I've been meaning to cover today's topic for a long time. More to the point, to demystify it, because tantric sex is definitely something that most of us have heard of. But for 99% of us, we really don't know what it means or what it's about. We're going to change that today. Some of the other names you will have heard are Tantra and Neo-Tantra. We're definitely working our way into the realm of advanced sexual skills today, and more specifically, sexual skills that are most relevant within relationships. To cover this topic, we have two guests, Mark Michaels and Patricia Johnson, a couple who have been teaching Tantra since 1999. That's 15 years. They have run seminars all over the US and in fact all around the world on the topic, and written many books, including 2 award-winning books on the topic. The 2 award-winning books are The Essence of Tantric Sexuality and Tantra for Erotic Empowerment. As you'll see in today's interview, Mark and Patricia are not only very knowledgeable in the field, but also both very open and generous with recounting their own personal experiences, which is always important to make this information real for us and to make it come alive. It certainly inspired me to dig deeper into this subject myself in the future, as we really just started to scratch the surface of tantric sex and Tantra, so consider this an introduction into Tantra, to see if it's a good fit for you right now and to whet your appetite to learn a bit more about it. It's certainly a topic we'll be coming back to explore a lot deeper in future episodes. As usual, to get the MP3 download, the interview transcript, and all the show notes, you can go to datingskillsreview.com/DSP73. I'm Angel Donovan, and this is the Dating Skills Podcast. This is a 14-year ongoing mission to discover the truth about what works in dating, sex, and relationships, to become a better man. Join me as I leave no stone unturned, chase down every expert, role model, and mentor with insights to get us to that goal as fast as possible. This show is about bringing you the best of that information so that you can take it in and change your life for the better, step by step, episode by episode. So Michaels and Johnson, have you been keeping up with the shows of the Masters with Sex on TV lately?
We haven't seen it. It's definitely on our list, but...
No, we haven't. Sorry.
Does anyone ever refer to you? Because the similarity is just a little bit too close there. Masters and Johnson, Michaels and Johnson.
When our first book came out, one of the blurbers described us as being a Masters and Johnson for the 21st century. So we kind of ran with it from there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice. Yeah, it's a pretty, it's not a bad way to start out at all, is it?
No.
It's quite a good recommendation there. Just for the audience, Masters and Johnson were some of the first sexologists to technically study sex and so on. And there's a show called Masters of Sex on TV right now, which is pretty popular. It's like a drama based on the whole relationship they had. So today we're talking about Tantra and tantric sex. And first of all, I just wanted to get some quick background on you guys. When did you get into this and kind of how did you getting into this whole area?
Well, for my part, in my teenage years and sort of early sexual experiences, had occasional moments that were transcendent and amazing. And so I knew there was something there in sex, but I never knew how to tap into that at will. And time went on, and in kind of in the mid to late 1980s, there were a few books on Tantra that came out and were popular, and I picked them up and looked at them, and I just kind of thought they were weird and couldn't really relate to the diagrams and the language and the kind of new agey feel that they had. But I remained intrigued, and about 10 years later, I had my first marriage had ended, and seeing on the internet that there were a lot of people teaching some form of Tantra in California. And I finally kind of screwed up my courage and went out and did a private session with someone, and then did a weekend that had a little bit of Tantra in the mix. And I was hooked. And I just started studying more deeply and trying to learn what I could.
So just for the audience, what hooked you? What was it about this first experience that made it something that hooked you? Because I imagine most of our audience have never, they've heard of Tantra, And this is why I'm doing this episode, because, you hear about it, but you're not really quite sure what it is. I think we'll get into why people are maybe a bit confused about the subject and what it is also. But I think maybe it's something they've never even thought of getting into also. What was it that hooked you that first time?
Well, it was really extraordinary, and it may be hard for some of the audience to actually believe. I certainly never imagined it for myself. The first day I got out there, I had booked this session with the woman who was teaching the tantric part of the weekend. And I go to her place and she says, okay, the first thing I want to teach you is this technique we call streaming. And it involves rocking your pelvis, pulsing your PC or pubococcygeal muscles. That's the muscles you use to start and stop the flow of pee. And breathing and moaning and doing this rhythmically. And she demonstrated it to me, and within a couple of minutes, she was having an orgasm. No, hands-free, no, fully clothed. And she looks at me and she says, now you try it. So I did, and it felt a little awkward, but it seemed as though maybe 10 minutes went by. I didn't have any genital arousal. I wasn't touching myself. I was just doing this movement and breathing and rocking. And I had this incredible experience. It was basically a full body, non-genital orgasm. And I was truly in a state of just altered consciousness for several days after this experience.
Wow.
And we do mention this in our current book, Partners in Passion, but I don't like to tell the story too much because I don't like to give people huge expectations, but it was really life-changing for me.
Right. And so you've kind of, as you just alluded to, it's different for everyone, I imagine.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And some people probably would get nothing from the technique, but I think a lot of people, if they learn, and guys especially, if they learn that there's more to having an orgasm than getting an erection and ejaculating, and that it really is a full body and an energetic experience, you can just open yourself up to a whole new spectrum of pleasurable experiences.
Right. It's about expanding your experience here. So, Patricia, when did you first come into contact with this?
Well, I would say during my college years, it's similar to Mark, have sexual experiences, and they seemed, I mean, at times mind blowing, but then again, sometimes it would seem like I got a glimpse into a realm that I thought that was more potential than what I was experiencing. So I started reading what I could on anything, any technologies that would allow me to tap into that sexual energy, to cultivate it and to share it with a partner. And that led me to reading about Taoist practices, Western sex magic practices, and also Tantra. And once I started reading those texts, for me, it was very much a description of what I was experiencing during sex. And it really gave me tools and a framework to start working with it. So I had always been interested in that. But at the time, when you're with younger men in particular, sometimes it's challenging to look at sex as a way of, not as something you should already know how to do, and we don't talk about it, but actually talk about it, explore it, and see what you can learn about one another. And so I didn't find any partners that were willing to do that. And it was years went by, and I saw an announcement that there was going to be a Tantra lecture in Manhattan, and I went to it, and it was Mark's first time lecturing after he had been certified as a teacher. So we met there.
And did you guys connect? Obviously, you're together now. Did you connect pretty immediately? And you've been teaching together for quite a while. How did that kind of evolve?
Well, it's an interesting.
Was it a master's in sex kind of drama for many years, or?
Gosh, no, actually, remarkably drama free. We exchanged emails for a while, and I found it very refreshing to speak about sexuality in this way, ways that, where you could talk about the energy of it. And it was just wonderful. And then we decided to get together and just continue the conversation over coffee. And it was...
And we basically, at that point, it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks after we'd met and we'd been exchanging emails. We didn't date. We didn't flirt. We just decided we were going to practice together.
Uh-huh.
And here we are 15 years later, or almost 16 years later. So
still
practicing. Still practicing. And still learning. It's Wow. No.
Yeah.
Oh,
Really?
gosh, it just gets better.
That's interesting. So, I mean, is this something that you think you'll ever stop learning about? And does it kind of go through a curve? Like you learn pretty rapidly for the first year or something, and it kind of plateaus, and then you have. Could you explain kind of how that's? Because it's been a long time, so it's interesting that you're still learning about it.
Well, in terms of the tantric tradition itself, after we got together, we really wanted to find someone who is traditionally trained and initiated in the authentic tradition. He's a Westerner, our teacher, but he started going to India in the early 1950s and was initiated as a Swami there. So a lot of the Tantra that gets talked about in the West is really just about the sexual aspect, which is only a small piece of the whole tradition. So we wanted much more than, we love the sex part, but we really wanted to have a context for the whole thing. And that the tradition is so vast and complex that you could spend several lifetimes trying to absorb it all.
Right. So the sexual part's a relatively small piece, and you could learn that within a year or.
I think just a few basic concepts can set people off in experiencing their sexuality in a whole new way. And what Mark mentioned earlier is huge to consider your sexuality as something that exists beyond just your physical muscular reactions, nerve reactions, and really recognize that pleasure can be expanded and experienced in virtually every part of the body. Just knowing that can set you on a whole new path.
Okay, so I want to take a step back here, to talk about this in more depth, because as you've kind of alluded to, it seems that there's traditional Tantra and Tantric sex, and then there's all these other things that have sprung out over time since the 1950s, since it's come to the West. And I think that's part of why many people have heard about Tantra and Tantric sex, but they're pretty unsure about it because it seems like there's a lot of different versions of it. And so I don't know if you can kind of give an overview of what it is originally and what it has become today and the kind of things you encounter about it and what you consider is, I guess you guys are more involved in the traditional aspect of it. And so the value of following the traditional versus all the different other practices that are out there today.
I would say that what we are is we're rooted in the tradition, but we're also very, very aware of the fact that we're 21st century Americans. We're not 8th century Indians. And the culture in which Tantra evolved is very, very different from ours. The India today is still really different. So the question for us is more, how do we take what our traditional training and knowledge and make it applicable for people who are living in a very different society? So really quickly, since I'm kind of more the history guy, the Tantric tradition, there's a book called The Kiss of the Yogini, which I think is the best sort of academic treatment of the tradition out there. And the thesis of that book is that Tantra evolved as a specific tradition, say in about 400 or 500 in the early Common Era in India. Roots go back way farther than that, but its distinctness took shape then. And at the core of that was a sexual ritual in which the female practitioners would actually go through a kind of spirit possession and be possessed by these ferocious deities. And they would transmit the energy of that possession to the male practitioners through the sexual ritual. And so the women in the original tradition were really the initiators and the carriers of the power. Over the next few hundred years, it sort of got spiritualized, is the way that David Gordon White describes it, and mainstreamed into more conventional Hindu and Buddhist thinking of the time. And so both Hinduism and Buddhism have tantric currents within them. Well, fast forward 1,500 years or so and talk about the 20th century. And beginning in the early 20th century, there was an attempt by some in India to reclaim and validate Tantra. And a British judge who was an early supporter of Indian independence was very involved with that. He coined the term Neo-Tantra, which then was picked up another 40 or 50 years later by Osho or Rajneesh, who called what he was teaching Neo-Tantra. He incorporated some tantric philosophy and a lot of pop psychology and a lot of other things and sort of blended them together and popularized what became the mainstream of what's called Tantra in America today.
So a lot of the myths that we encounter is that Tantra is equal to sacred sex, for instance, or that Tantra is a form of sex work, which we have nothing against. It's just not Tantra, so to speak.
Yeah, we gave a talk in New York City, and a woman came up to us at the end, and she said, I'm a professional escort, and in my business, when people talk about Tantra, they mean a prostate massage.
Oh, really?
So
Interesting.
So yeah, it's been watered down and applied to all kinds of things that really have
used for marketing purposes, and it, by all means, does not encompass the whole tradition.
Right. And so, what proportion of the Tantra out there, or the Neo Tantra, is more traditional versus all the different spin-offs today? Is it like 20%? And there's, because it seems like there's a vast kind of misunderstanding compared to other areas. So it's like everyone has their own interpretation.
Yeah.
There are not a lot of people who have traditional training who are teaching the sexual aspects. It's a very small minority. There are people who've got very, very strong roots in yoga and may have some traditional training who are doing the sexual stuff. But there are a very, very large percentage of people who are totally coming out of a neo-tantric kind of background, which can be great and it can be fine and it can be really valuable for people. Where it gets problematic for us is when people aren't really forthright about what their background is, or they just make stuff up and they say they're teaching Tantra, which we've heard people say the most bizarre things. And,
that Tantra is channeled teachings or stuff like that. And just for your listeners to clarify, what we mean by traditional Tantra is a concept of lineage. And that means that you have a direct line to a teacher who has a direct line to the teacher before him or her, and then it goes back so that there's a teacher-to-student line. Hence lineage, yeah.
Initiation is really in the classical tradition, it's an initiatory tradition, and there's an idea that when you have a teacher and the teacher initiates you or empowers you to go out and teach others, that you've been given a kind of energy from that tradition that's behind you.
Right. I think that seems like there's kind of quite a bit of conflict. And when I was like researching for this, I came across some. I'd like to get into the practicalities of what this actually is to give people, the audience, a much better, clearer idea of what this is all about. But first, some of the criticism I came across was a guy called George Feuerstein in his book Tantra: Path of Ecstasy. I assume you know about this. And basically, his summary is that a lot of people are attracted to Tantra for purely genital impulses or neurotic emotional needs, but they want to clothe it in an aura of spirituality. And certainly the only time I ever came across Tantra was like talking to a girl who was probably working in a modern spirituality business. I was actually on a date with her. She pretty much had this same view that people were using Tantra as an excuse and kind of like putting this clove of spirituality around sex just so that they could have a lot more sex. And so she was using it in a very derogatory way that she was looking at it, kind of a negative way. And I'm just wondering, is it something you often come across, this kind of negative criticism today?
Yeah, I would say, one thing we call that like spiritual excuses or spiritual justification for your actions. And what it reflects is that there are a cultural negativity toward hookup or casual sex as a valid way of expressing your sexuality and a valid way of being a sexual person in the world. And so sometimes, or just sex for pleasure's sake. And so sometimes couching it in a spiritual term then suddenly gives people license to have more sex, I guess. Does that sound like what your friend was saying?
We also, frankly, do get criticized by the very conservative and traditional people. I mean, I've seen things said about us that we're doing the same thing, and it is sticky. But the problem with the conflation of Tantra and sacred sexuality, or the assumption that that's all there is to it, is that then it becomes a replication of like American Puritan way of thinking. So the sex that you have that is spiritualized and you light candles and you do all this ritual around it, that's sacred sex. And the quickie that you had or the encounter with someone one night stand is profane. And so we're back into this kind of sex negative dichotomous thinking.
But it's our understanding that anytime you're sexually aroused, you're in an altered state of consciousness, and thereby that is in and of itself a sacred state.
It's what you do with that's important afterwards. And to go back, just one of your early questions is about can you learn it all? The attitude in Tantra, and I think this is one of the ways in which we try to translate the ancient tradition into the modern one, is that there's the potential to be for want of a better word, enlightened in any experience that you have. There's the potential for something mystical to happen in anything that you do. It's really about bringing your awareness to it and treating your experiences without an attitude of, I want an outcome, but I'm going to explore, I'm going to experiment, I'm going to see what happens when I do this. I think for me, that's the core of what the tantric approach to living is about. It's about thinking of yourself as an ongoing experiment.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that like Tantra, because the other part of it, as you say, is not about the sex, it's about the spirituality and kind of the journey, as many people are going through their own kind of spiritual and self-development journeys, it's kind of very similar, right? It's just one type of spiritual, one view of how we're growing as human beings as we go through life. Is that a fair way to explain it?
Yeah, I mean, I think where it departs a little bit from many, many other traditions, and I think one of the things that appeals to us about it is that it really doesn't create hierarchies, and it doesn't, as a tradition, it doesn't reject anything. So a lot of people, and a lot of the sex negativity in the spiritual realm is like, it's about denying the body, and it's about trying to transcend something. The tantric approach is that the transcendent exists in everything. It's how we approach it that matters.
So in a way, the tantric sex is just applying the tantra to the area of tantric sex, to sex. And that's become more popular, but it wasn't as emphasized in its roots. Or has been a kind of like, I mean, because when you first talked about the history, it sounded like some of the first steps were basically sexual in their nature.
Yes, and certainly even as it got sort of more mainstream, the sexual ritual continued, and it's still practiced today. But on the other hand, many, many tantric practitioners, probably the vast majority today, are celibate. So Buddhist monks, Tibetan Buddhist monks are practicing a form of Tantra.
I think you've hit on something very important. It's a tantric attitude. And if you understand the attitude and the concepts, you can apply it to virtually every aspect of life. So
many other topics, I mean, that it kind of dovs and tails with, there's things like kundalini energy, activating the chakras. And it's almost like, for some people, this sounds like a bit woo, right? So that's why I wanted to bring this stuff up, to tackle these kind of ideas. And also its relationship with yoga. Could you kind of highlight how you see it dovetailing with these areas?
In our tradition and in our training, the kundalini energy is nothing really. It's the life force that we're born with. It's in all of us. Its activity is increased when we're in a state of sexual arousal, but it's always there.
So there's no like kundalini awakening. Sometimes there's a lot of mythology around that causing, psychotic episodes or people not being able to handle the energy. And that's not really our understanding. Our understanding is that it does flow through you every day and at every moment. But the tantric technologies teach you how to tap into it consciously and by choice, and then cultivate it and expand it. It's not like you have to blast through your chakra system and have this dramatic awakening.
And to pick up on the chakra system, a lot of people talk about this and attach all kinds of ideas to it. The important thing about the chakra system is really that whether there's any physical reality to the chakras or not, it's a way of envisioning and imagining and working with your body, using the chakras as a kind of map for when you're directing energy. Your imagination is where it all starts, really. And so if you're thinking about the chakras, they can be a vehicle for concentrating your imagination.
So basically the chakras, for people at home, this is the way I understand it, they're just points on the body, a bit like acupuncture points, where there's energy focused on the body. Is that how you explain it? So it's about focusing on those areas in order to let the energy flow? I'm probably explaining this in a terrible way.
Yeah, well, they're actually, they exist within the body cavity. So they're full body. So unfortunately, a lot of the images of the chakra system show just the surface of the body. And then they show this different kind of geometric patterns or something that represents each chakra. They exist within the body. So when you're with your lover, you can touch the back of their body and encourage that erotic energy to flow to the point where your hand is, for instance.
There are lots of deep and complex esoteric components to the study of the chakra system. And just to give one example of that, the first chakra, which is often called the root chakra, is at the floor of the pelvic bowl. And it's said it's our grounding. Some people talk about it as being survival. It's the most primal of the chakras. And it has an associated sense which is smell. If you think about the sense of smell is our most primal sense.
In
It
fact,
bypasses the narrative part of the brain.
right. And in fact, it's probably that sense of smell that really attracts you to other people more so than the outer qualities of them. It's very, very primal. If your listeners have ever had the experience of being with someone and they seem great, they look great and everything, and they just don't smell quite right. And it's just like the chemistry is not quite there. And that's really powerful.
Right, right. And then, there's scientific research behind that too, relating to pheromones and so on as well. So that's definitely something I've experienced also with myself. There's women that smell great and you want to spend more time with them because of that. That's for sure.
And they may not smell great to somebody else. That's the really interesting part.
Right. And we're not talking about perfume here, just to be clear.
Yeah.
It's the way the person smells. Okay, great. All right, so I wanted to touch on those things because I'm sure people are going to hear about chakras and kundalini energy. To just give a rough overview, I know all of these subjects are pretty deep and so on, but just so that they got some kind of idea of what that's about. But in terms of more like the practice, where do people start when it comes to tantric sex? What are kind of the first steps? Where would someone go to take their first steps? Do they normally go to some kind of meeting like you went to? Is it some kind of course that they look up on the internet or somewhere? Or how do people generally start? Or perhaps it's a book, like one of your books, for example.
Well, our first 3 books are really focused on the sexual aspects of Tantra. And actually, our 3rd book is called Great Sex Made Simple. And I think it's a very easy and accessible introduction to the sexual aspects of Tantra. And it probably has stuff that people who actually are more familiar with it will be a little surprised by as well. So Great Sex Made Simple, I think, is a great starting place.
Great starting point. And then our second book, Tantra for Erotic Empowerment, is actually a workbook. So books, I mean, ideally you want to learn in person, but books really open up the whole world. And that's a great place to start with information. And then once you're armed with information, you can start to investigate anybody who's teaching in your area. But please look at their bio carefully and see if it resonates with you before you commit to anything.
Well, what kind of things would you look out for? So anyway, I like kind of the approach. I mean, like if you're interested in tantric sex and what it may offer in terms of expanding your experience of sex, then reading your books obviously is a good first step. Although, like, we're not talking about basically reading the books and applying at home. It's not like a home course where you can start practicing Tantra yourself.
Actually,
it's more that, or you can?
Yes, actually, both of those books. Great Sex Made Simple is has tip format. Each chapter is about 600 to 800 words, and you can crack open a chapter, read it to your lover, and give it a try that night. It's really fun and very useful in that way.
Okay. So if you're with a partner, you can. What would be the first kind of thing you might read and start working on with your partner as a first step?
Eye gazing.
Yeah, right? I mean, in the partnered context, it's derived from a classical practice. And in the partnered context, this is the first thing that we teach. It's the simplest and probably the most profound. And a lot of people don't do it. And it's very simply formally gazing into one another's eyes for a period of 3 to 5 minutes. Some people, it may be a little hard to go that long at first, but build up to that. This does come out of a classical practice, which is used for meditation. And it is a form of meditating on each other. And it works on multiple levels because it harmonizes your moods. It recreates the emotional experience of falling in love on a regular basis.
Right. Because if you think, watch young lovers somewhere in public and how they can't take their eyes off of one another. And oftentimes they're doing this in silence. They're just totally enthralled with gazing at one another, and people think, oh, that's so cute. They're looking at each other so much because they're falling in love. But what's really happening is that they're falling in love because they are meeting each other's gaze. And this is really powerful for people who are interested in having a long-term relationships. It's huge.
Yeah, I didn't know this was a tantric practice, but I've done these kind of things myself. And I would say I'd be a bit careful with it. Like you say, I do it inside a relationship, not so much outside of relationships, because it can be quite powerful in terms of the connection
Yeah.
it brings to both sides.
We're really laughing because this is the first practice we did together, and we
And there we are,
Here we are.
16 years later.
So yes,
And we still
It's
do
powerful,
it. I mean,
yeah.
we still do it, all this time later. And one of the really wonderful things about it, and this is maybe not purely a Tantra thing, but it is in the sense that because it's a meditative technique, if we feel like there's conflict brewing between us, we will, instead of having a conversation about it, 95% of the time, we'll take a time out and we'll gaze into one another's eyes. And that's a way of diffusing a lot of the intensity that might come with the conflict that's emerging and getting back into harmony so that we can address the problem.
So what we like to say is that while communication is important, talking is overrated, really overrated.
Right. Yeah, well, often it's not about what has been said. It can be about other things that haven't been said. And so just for the guys at home, we've often spoken about mirror neurons on this show with David Tien on the account. He's a professor. And I think this is very related to this topic, of course, from a scientific aspect. This is really a technique for enabling you to connect, as you've been saying. And it's very surprising. I think the people at home are going to think, it's just looking into someone's eyes. But until you've actually tried this, I don't think you can really understand. And it is very uncomfortable at first. I think everyone has this period where you want to look away. So, for instance, when I've done it with my partner, I've introduced it to them, and I have to keep asking them to keep looking and stay looking, stay with me on it, because the natural inhibitions kind of make you want to look away all the time. Is this what you found with your students and in general?
Often, and I mean, there are a couple of other things. People will often laugh. We've also found with long-term couples that many of them have really lost the habit of doing this. And that can be a real sign that things are not going very well. If it's too difficult, or we had one person say to their partner, "You're not doing it right."
Okay.
That's a sign that something's amiss.
Right. Because of course, there's no right way to look at someone in the eyes.
Well, we have a certain technique, that the way that we teach it, that is specific, and there's a good reason for it. And basically, and Patricia will explain the reason, I'll give the technique. Basically, when I'm looking into her eyes, I'm not putting any attention at all on my left eye. I'm just thinking about looking into her left eye, so straight across out of my right. And I'm trying to focus as much of my awareness on that eye and looking into her eye as I possibly can.
Left eye. So there's esoteric reasons why this is powerful. The right side of the body is seen as sort of the energetic sending part of the body, and the left more receptive. Also, there's brain function that plays into this, and that gives the left hemisphere a task, just a slight task. It says, okay, I'm going to focus on my right eye into my partner's left eye. And that's sometimes enough to silence that chatter that can happen, especially if you're dealing with conflict. And it just gives it, we call it throwing your left hemisphere a bone to chew on, just enough activity so that the mind can free up and get into that meditative state.
There's also research that shows that people, generally speaking, reveal their emotions more on their left side, on the left side of the face than on the right. This has been known for about 40 years. And I think poker players have known it for longer than that.
Okay. Good tip there.
But when you're doing this in a dyadic situation, you're not thinking about like, oh, I'm trying to read what her mood is, but you're unconsciously, you're going to be picking it up. And it's another way that you're getting back into balance with one another.
So just for people at home, just because it might be a bit confusing, your right eye looking at her left eye, is the eye directly in front of you looking at you?
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So, and then she's doing the same with her side. She's looking from her right to left eye directly in front. Yeah.
And this another beautiful way to practice this is alone and at a mirror. And it's really, really important. We're not taught to regard ourselves with reverence or appreciation or a sense of caretaking. And we look at ourselves in the mirror, we make sure everything's in place, and then we rush off. We kind of objectify ourselves. And it's important to once a day look at yourself and really look with appreciation, the deep love you have for yourself, and really make that eye contact. It's really incredible.
Yeah, I mean, we taught this at a early on when we were teaching at an event, and a few years went by, and someone came up to us and said, "You probably don't remember me, but a few years back you taught this workshop and you talked about eye gazing with myself in the mirror, and I went home and I started doing it, and it completely changed my life." He felt that it had given him a much deeper sense of love and appreciation for himself, and that then freed him up to interact with other people a lot more freely and easily.
Yeah, and this is really important. I mean, if you have a deep, rich relationship with yourself and one that's filled with love and admiration, then you can tap into that potential with others. If you haven't cultivated that or really looked into what it feels like to have that kind of self relationship, you're never going to find it externally.
So where I first came across this was actually during sex. I think you guys are talking about basically sitting there and just looking into each other's eyes. But where I encountered actually was actually during sex, and I found it made sex a lot more powerful. So just to clarify, you are talking about basically sitting in face, like maybe the first time you met in a coffee shop and you were doing it in a coffee shop?
No, we talked in the coffee shop, and then when the first time we got together to practice sexually together, before we did anything directly physical, we did the eye gazing. And then it became something that we did on a formal basis every time we saw each other at first. And now it's second nature, and we don't do it as a formal practice unless there's a real need to do it. Otherwise, we just find each other's eyes all the time.
So you mentioned a really powerful technique, and that's to eye gaze during sex. And that's one way of working with the chakra system, right? So you'll be working with the third eye by eye gazing with your partner. And the really, really powerful time to do it is when you're actually having an orgasm. And just it's both coming, that energy will come through your eyes as well as you'll feel it in your genitals. And it's a nice accelerator.
And if you combine breathing with that, you're amplifying the sexual experience exponentially, really.
Okay, well, let's talk about the breathing, because I know that's a big part of Tantra as well. What is it about the breathing that is important?
Well, there are lots and lots of different breathing techniques, but the simplest answer is that in Tantra and yoga, breathing is the core of how we direct energy within the body. The idea is actually, if you hear the word prana in yoga, prana doesn't just refer to our breath, but it refers to the atmosphere around us and the energy that exists in the world and that we're taking in with every breath. So pranayama actually can be translated, in addition to regulation of the breath, as regulation of energy. So that's kind of the philosophical foundation for it. What that means is that you can change your emotional state by changing the way that you breathe. If you're in a sexual situation, if you're both concentrating and aware of how you're breathing, you can use that breath to alter the experience of sex in a myriad of different ways. So like breathing, you could try breathing reciprocally, or you can try breathing in unison. Initially, especially, it's good to breathe with vocalization.
An exercise that your listeners might be interested in doing is during self-pleasuring, and it's a two-step exercise or two multiple session exercise. First, you just want to find out your normal pattern of breathing as you get into higher states of arousal and as you move into orgasm. What do you normally do with your breath? Once you understand that,
not always easy to remember.
Yeah, sometimes you're really flying and you don't know what you did. But once you understand what that is, the next time you self-pleasure, alter your breathing in some way. One way, and you'll collect the data. You'll see what does this new breath type do to the quality of your orgasm, and what does it do to your arousal? And it's a lot of fun. And so
that is, I mean, I've had some pretty crazy experiences with breathing.
Oh, good.
So I can vouch for that. It has a bigger impact. It's quite amazing the change it places on the experience. So can you give any guidelines as to what to expect, or is it different for everyone? Like, is it what would faster breathing or deeper breathing or more shallow breathing? What are these the ways you look at changing breathing?
Well, in the broadest sense, if you're going to breathe more deeply and more slowly, you're likely to reduce your level of arousal somewhat. And therefore, especially if you're worried about ejaculating too fast, it can be a way to slow that down. Shallower, more rapid breathing tends in most people to
ramp it
up. Yeah.
Or holding your breath. can also bring you, a way of peaking over the edge. So, I mean, all of these things are going to give you different qualities. If you want an energizing orgasm, but it is individual, like you point out. It very much is individual.
What is the goal here? Because I know that another thing, as I understand it, is that there's less emphasis on orgasm. So I was wondering, what's the difference between Western sexology or culture versus Tantra today? In the West now, it seems like we have a huge emphasis on orgasm versus the experience of sex. If we think about the popular press and everything's about orgasms. And how would you look at that?
I think it's not necessarily, tantric practices don't avoid orgasm, but what they try to do is tap into what the orgasmic state brings to the body and how the body reacts in orgasmic states. Tap into those things by practices that don't limit to that physical reaction of orgasm, which is 8 seconds of repeated release of muscular tension, and then it's over. So tap into it so that these states can be long lasting, those altered states or the euphoric states.
And it's very unfortunate the way that we've gotten so fixated on orgasm in our culture, because the tantric approach, as Patricia was saying, is really much more about the journey than the destination. And I think we're so conditioned to be focused on the goal in sex, and the goal is getting off, that I think a lot of people miss out on a tremendous amount of enjoyment. The reason for tantric sex, and the reason that Sting said, 7 hours and all that stuff, is because in the ritual in Tantra, and generally the approach in tantric sex, is that if you build and prolong arousal for half an hour or more, typically, you're creating in the body a flood of neurotransmitters and stimulating chemicals, and you're actually changing your consciousness. And when we have an orgasm, we release oxytocin and prolactin, which leads to a relaxed state, often to sleep. But if you build and prolong the arousal, you can have the intense mystical experience that happens for many people at orgasm long before you have an orgasm. And that state can persist for longer after, if you do have one, because the drop-off from the prolactin and the oxytocin is much more counterbalanced by the stimulant chemicals that are released prior.
Yeah. So there's two sides to this. As you were talking, I was thinking we're trying to grow our own experience of sex, as well as we're trying to grow our experience of sex together. Because right now we're talking about how you prolong the experience and kind of the excitation you experience yourself. And before with the eye gazing, we're also talking about how we influence each other and our states together. Does Tantra look at both of those areas, or is it both with the goal of improving the spiritual experience of sex together? What's kind of the goal behind it?
Well, you work both with your sexual life with yourself and also with your partner or partners, so that you're cultivating that rich inner understanding of your body through a lot of these practices.
If I had to answer that, I think that it's much more on the latter. Like the sexual ritual in Tantra, not the earliest form so much, but as it became more spiritualized, the practitioners were there to embody the divine and to serve each other, really. So the idea is that in a sexual encounter, in a ritualized setting, my job is to facilitate Patricia's experience. And similarly, her job is to facilitate mine, to take me higher. So it's not about me getting off. It's about me facilitating her and vice versa. And we think this is a really crucial idea that can be applied not just in the bedroom, but in relationships generally. We're so, in our society, so focused on getting ours.
And do you think that we're talking again about the experience, like with breathing and eye gazing, you'll take yourself into a different state of consciousness. And then when you do have your orgasm, it will be completely different because of that. Do you think the very fact that you've done that is going to influence your partner directly? Because the way you're communicating with each other with the eyes and so on is going to be different because of your state of consciousness. So, in a way, it's working on yourself, but it's having this partnership. It's having an end result with the sexual partnership.
Yeah, and it's through the other that we get, when we give more, we usually get more. And that's certainly...
provided it's mutual,
yeah.
right?
Okay. So when you're talking about giving, what are you talking about?
Well, it's the focus on the other. I mean, this can translate to all areas of life with a partner, but during the sexual encounter, it's just facilitating their arousal, being present, and really knowing and taking in the information of how their erotic journey is going. And when you both are mutually focused that way, it's amazing. Now, if one is like, "Oh yeah, bring it on, I'm enjoying this," and is not equally bringing that same thing to the table, it's a give and take, right? We're looking for a give
Right.
in sex.
For the people at home, I think you're talking about staying in contact with the other person without just going on your own mission of getting to the end goal of pleasure. Like running off into the distance and, I want to get mine. You get your orgasm really quickly, but in fact, you are hardly looking at the person. And maybe you were even thinking about the last porno movie you were watching or something. There's a visualization in your head, which means you're completely disconnected from the reality.
Right. It's even more than that. It's really a kind of taking pleasure in her pleasure and using that to build up and build up. And so if I'm just thinking about, I just want to get off, right? I might have an okay experience. But if we're both thinking like, wow, she's so turned on, I'm going to get more turned on, and it takes it higher and higher. It's not just about seeking my own.
Great. So I want to go back again to Masters and Johnson, your pals, because they defined the sexual response cycle as 4 phases: excitement, plateau, orgasmic peaking, and then resolution. Does Tantra, I understand the Tantric view is kind of more extended than that, and it looks at it a bit different. So I was wondering if that would be an interesting thing to discuss to kind of get the idea of how tantric sex is different.
Yeah, you can work off that very same model. And if you draw it out as a tantric model, what you're going to have is that arousal phase that is extended. So the arousal goes on, like Mark suggested, around 30 minutes or more, or whatever works for each individual listener. But in that arousal period, we're not talking about friction type sex or penetrative sex. It can be any form of arousal that works for your body. So involve any implements, any thoughts, or any partners that work for you. Because the goal is, once you get incredibly aroused, incredibly turned on, that's when you're tapping into your brain chemistry. So that has a very important purpose in that.
And the arousal phase, I mean, I think, and I actually have never thought about this in this way before until just now. But if you look at the Masters and Johnson arousal phase, it's basically a straight line. And then it's a straight line with a plateau and the spike of orgasm and the drop off. The tantric arousal phase might be a little bit more jagged. It's going up, but there's going to be potentially at least some points where it drops off during the arousal. So it's maybe more like a stairway.
Steps, yeah.
And that's fine. The point is to keep the build going and let the drop-offs happen and then go a little higher and keep going a little higher. And the plateau phase is going to be much less of a factor in the tantric model.
It seems to be much shorter. And then the orgasm happens if you choose, and the drop-off can be less, so that you're energized and you're left feeling very, very vibrant.
Right. That's another aspect of this I wanted to talk about, because in some of our episodes, we've talked about the evolution of online porn and how that's become detrimental for some men through overuse and when we're talking about the dopamine connection and how it affects your motivation and other things just by having got used to this type of stimulation in ways that you don't really want. You become demotivated, you lose your experience of sex to a certain extent. So a couple of questions there is, first of all, when you look at self-stimulation from a tantric point of view, it sounded earlier that that's kind of something normal and it's accepted and it's looked upon as a good thing. Is that correct?
In our tradition, yes. I mean, I'm sure there are branches that would feel otherwise, but for what we got from our teacher is that it's really where you start, and it really is. It can be a magical practice. It can be a practice that you use for self-exploration and self-discovery. It really is crucial to know your own body. Right. And to learn how to work with your energy.
With this kind of awareness, see, this is a big attitude shift. And if you have a purpose for why you're self-pleasuring and you want to glean knowledge from yourself, it's very acceptable to use whatever tool works for you. And that can include visual stimulation or erotica on the internet. I think sometimes the masturbatory practices gets conflated when things become dramatized, when things become compulsive. And if any type of activity becomes a compulsive activity, or it breaches your inner self, your inner values, or anything like that, it becomes problematic. But it's not always necessarily the activity that's the problem. It's how you're going about the activity. I mean, another issue people have is their masturbatory practices. And if they're only able to orgasm with extreme stimulation, very firm grip, if you're male-bodied or something else like that, then you develop a sexual response that's not, no partner can replicate for you.
Yeah, we all have our tried and true way to get off, and that's fine. But if we just keep carving that same groove, it can become a problem. So being flexible in your self-pleasuring practices,
Right.
even, is a great way to keep yourself
Really,
flexible as a sexual being generally.
basic practice in that is just to switch to your non-dominant hand. And you're going to learn something new. You're going to have a whole different experience. So
yeah, I mean, there it's very different from the porn. The porn, I think one of the arguments is that the experience is very unique, and you're actually like grooving that same groove, like to use your analogy, the connection of your neurons every single time. And it becomes very unique, and you need more and more stimulation to get the same effects. And then that has some negative impact on energy when you start to like masturbate, like, I don't know, 10 times a day. And some guys are masturbating, more than that because of this groove they've started to get into. But you also touched upon the energy and maintaining energy in the Tantra practice. And as I understand it, like part of the Tantra practice is about maintaining some of the man's energy, because the stereotype is that the guy falls asleep after sex, right? So how does Tantra look at that element and the fact that the man tends to get tired after sex, and how regulating that?
There's a lot of variation in that, in attitudes about that. The whole idea of it being a loss of energy and stuff is more associated with the Taoist tradition than the Tantric tradition. In our training, the idea is that if you work with the energy and you visualize spreading the energy through the body in various ways, and you build the arousal, there's no meaningful change or loss of energy when you ejaculate as a man. We feel, and in our background, the non-ejaculatory thing is really useful as a learning tool, because it's a great way to start learning how to have non-ejaculatory full-body orgasms. But if you make it into a goal, or you treat it as the right way to do it, you're again falling back into a kind of a trap.
So also the falling asleep is, I mean, we encourage people to keep their current sexual practices and the understanding of sex. And as they look into Tantra, think of expanding that, adding to it, not losing or denying their earlier sexuality. And being able to masturbate and know you're going to fall asleep is such a great tool. And I would hate for it to give that up,
It's your most basic form of sex magic, right? You have an intention to fall asleep.
Yeah.
Do your sexual act, and boom, you fall asleep. It's perfect.
Yeah, it's great. That's definitely a good situation for that use. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I want to round off with a couple of personal questions to see if you've kind of encountered, because obviously you've had a lot of experience in this area of your lives. So if you could, tell me if this is too sensitive, but what was the best sexual experience or aspect of a relationship to date that you've experienced thanks to Tantra, or just in general?
Yesterday.
It gets better every day.
Seriously, yesterday was quite amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we took a whole afternoon to just play around and explore. It was really amazing.
Okay, well, to kind of describe that to the users in terms of what could they expect, like what's out there, to kind of open their eyes a bit to that, how would you describe that experience?
Well, basically, we've been working extremely hard. We've not really set aside a whole day to just interact together in some time. And so we did yesterday, and
so we set up a massage table. We sat, naked together. We talked a lot. And then moved into making love a little bit, and then not, and then sometimes practicing something called karezza, which is a meditative sort of
soft. You
soft,
insert when you don't have an erection. You use a lot of lube, and you just try to stay together, united, without any motion.
And it's just a very sweet way of making love. And it's a way of just languidly going through the day or having a few hours together. Because usually we're like, all right, we've got to get out to dinner plans later on. It's either now or never. And then that can affect the quality of the sex. Still fun.
It's so great. But yeah, so it was just this very languid and very, very whole body focused kind of encounter. And then gradually as the day went on, we did kind of get into more friction-y kind of sex. But there was this very prolonged buildup, and it was really just very tantric.
Great. And for that, what you did was you kind of blocked the day off and you said, we're not going to have any distractions. We're just going to be with each other for the whole day. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think even it's important to limit your social media before these kind of days too, because any second you could get an image or an email that knocks your brain off of where you really want to be.
Well, I imagined you'd actually put your phones in another room or something.
Oh, yeah.
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 Because that's very distracting. I find it terrible. There's so many times I've just deleted my Facebook account.
And phone going. It's we have one of these phones that tells you who's calling. Vocalize it. I don't know if there's a way to turn it off, but so we have the phone in the other room, but still sometimes we can hear who it is, and it's like, Mom.
It's like, how do they know to call then?
Great, thank you for sharing that. And I mean, I know some of these things are a bit less comfortable for some people to share, but so I think it's very valuable to open people's eyes a bit to different ways of doing things. And who besides yourself would you recommend for high quality advice in this area?
Barbara Carellis.
Yeah, Barbara Carellis.
She's quite well known. She's a very good friend of ours. She is explicitly a neo-tantric teacher. She makes no bones about it. She's got great integrity. She knows her stuff, and she really is wonderful to work with.
Yeah. And if your listeners want to learn more about our work, they can visit our website, which is www.michaelsandjohnson.com.
Very easy to remember there. Well, hopefully they're not going to get confused by all the references to Masters and Johnson throughout the show. Michaels and Johnson. Well, great. Thank you very much for your time today. And there's actually one question that we ask everyone who comes on the show, so I'd love to ask you guys that too, as a final adios. So what would be your top 3 recommendations to help men improve this aspect of their life as fast as possible?
One would definitely be start exercising your pubococcygeal muscles. We didn't talk about that too much, but it's really...
Okay, that's a very long word as well.
The PC muscles, the Kegel muscles, what you use to start and stop the flow of urine. That's really the best way to identify them. So that's really crucial.
I would say I'd encourage them to be curious and educate yourself as much as you can about sexuality, sexual response, physiology. Everybody loves a intelligent, curious, interested lover. So,
and related to that, ask your partner what works for you. Don't be afraid to be told what works and what doesn't. Don't feel that your masculinity is being threatened if your partner's giving you some direction.
Little to the left.
Yeah, certainly can be very helpful. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been great talking to you guys, and it's a very new topic for us. We haven't talked about this before, so it's been a great introduction. And of course, there'll be links to your books and so on in the show notes, and we'll have that reference to your site as well there. Is there anything else we should be adding in terms of Facebook? Anything else where you're present, where you can be reached easily?
Well,
we're on Facebook as well, and Twitter.
Our Twitter account is Tantra P as in Patricia, M as in Mark, Tantra PM on Twitter. And just our 5th book is coming out probably early 2015. So maybe we'll hit you up and we can continue our conversation again.
That would be great, because it's obviously a very deep subject. We've just really I can feel we've only just touched the first superficial part of it here today, but I think it was a good introduction nonetheless to give people an idea of what Tantra really is all about.
No, the questions were great. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to speaking again sometime.
Great.
Okay,
have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Take control of your dating life today. Take one idea or one insight from today's episode and apply it today. Don't wait. Do it today. That's all it takes to change your life, step by step, episode by episode. Learn more about what I, Angel Donovan, and my team do at datingskillsreview.com. How we help men like you take control of their dating lives.